Publicly humiliated at the airport for nothing but the color of his skin, a tech billionaire quietly triggers an unprecedented counterstrike. No one knows that his cold, calculated phone call will shake an entire airline empire, expose a deeply rooted system of discrimination, and ignite a transformation like never before. Coal Air, where everyone belongs. Marcus Reid stepped into the international terminal of Reagan Airport with the calm demeanor of a man who had commanded more rooms of power than he could count. His perfectly tailored black suit hugged his tall, athletic frame, and the Richard Mille watch glinting on his wrist didn't need to boast. It was simply a part of him, like his breath. No one saw the array of artificial intelligence systems running silently behind that composed face. No one noticed that the software designs controlling nearly half of this airport bore his name. And, of course, no one detected the vigilance he always carried with him, ever since he'd realized that his skin entered a room before his reputation. He nodded politely to a security officer standing by the baggage scanner. The man hesitated for a split second, then straightened up. No words, no greeting, but that look. Marcus had seen it thousands of times, an invisible suspicion, taught by habit, not by reason. The checkpoint was swift, everything was in order. He headed straight to the first-class check-in area of Regalus Airways, the airline that had sent him a personal invitation just 3 days prior. In his pocket were a VIP cabin ticket, a diamond-tier priority customer card, and a handwritten note from the CEO himself. But that invitation couldn't soften her gaze. Behind the counter sat a middle-aged woman with platinum hair and an air of confidence, as if she ran the entire airline. Pinned to her chest, Denise Crawford, ground services supervisor. "Good morning," Marcus said, handing over his documents with a polite, measured smile. Denise didn't reply. She stared straight at his face, then dropped her eyes to his customer card, inspecting it like she was checking a counterfeit bill. An odd silence stretched between them. "Are you traveling for business or a vacation?" she asked, dragging out each word as if probing for a contradiction in his answer. "Business," Marcus replied curtly, maintaining his smile. Her fingers tapped the keyboard with lazy speed and an unconcealed irritation. "Your name is Marcus Reid." "That's right. Reid Technologies?" "Also correct." This time Denise didn't bother hiding it. She turned to her younger colleague, whispering just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "That name sounds familiar. Probably some startup backed by someone. Got lucky with the lottery, I bet." Marcus said nothing. He'd heard lines like that his whole life. They no longer made him angry. They made him quiet, and they made him remember. Denise picked up his ticket with 2 fingers, as if afraid of contamination, then handed it back with a piercing stare. "The first-class lounge entrance is over there, but you'll need to verify one more step with security at the gate. New procedure." Marcus tilted his head slightly. I've never had to—" "New procedure," she interrupted, her eyes icy. "We just want to make sure all passengers are in their proper place." Those final words landed like a slap. A middle-aged man in a polo shirt standing nearby smirked. "Probably got lost. Economy tickets are at the other gate, buddy." Marcus locked eyes with Denise. "My ticket is valid. If there's anything else required, feel free to call someone with more authority." "Gladly," Denise shot back, spinning around to grab the phone, her voice sharp. "I need security assistance at the first-class lounge. Urgent." Marcus didn't speak. He just stood there, back straight, face unchanging, as if he'd been preparing for this moment his entire life. And when the phone in his pocket buzzed, he glanced at the screen and pressed a single button. "Protocol, Raven. Begin observation mode." Marcus no longer looked at Denise Crawford, nor did he glance at the security officer who had just approached, a tall, imposing figure whose taut uniform suggested he was ready for an emergency takedown. Instead, Marcus subtly shifted his gaze to his wrist, where his watch flickered with a faint green light. The signal had been sent. This battle didn't begin with a shout, but with a tap on the encrypted interface embedded in his watch, a device housing every protocol of resistance Marcus had quietly prepared over the past 20 years. "Please follow me, sir," the security officer said, his tone far more courteous than Denise's, though his eyes still carried a trace of suspicion. "Of course." Marcus nodded, his voice so composed it was impossible to tell whether it signaled compliance or a warning. He followed the officer down a long corridor leading to the area's security office. Passing glances met him, some sympathetic, most averted. He was all too familiar with the sensation, being seen as a threat simply for existing. When the office door closed behind him, he pulled out his phone. A single touch. No code, no password. The device's retinal scanner had authenticated him with his first glance. "Reid here. Protocol Raven. Full spectrum engagement. Begin observation mode." 6 words, spoken just loud enough to evade the officer's ears, but somewhere, across dozens of data centers, the machine he'd built sprang to life. No sirens, no explosions, just data beginning to shift. On the 34th floor of Reid Technologies headquarters, a small team of cybersecurity experts looked up from their screens in unison. The text on their control panels flipped from standby to live. "We're on," one of them whispered. Across the city, Carmen Hale, a woman who had once led a high-level CIA intelligence unit, received a ping through her wireless earpiece. No emotion crossed her face, only absolute focus in her eyes. "Ravens live." "Affirmative." "Understood. Proceed with Phase 0, passive intel collection." No one but Marcus knew the full plan. Even Carmen only understood it layer by layer, like a series of interlocking vaults. He'd learned that lesson from early betrayals. Fragment the truth so no one could betray it all. While the security officer flipped through Marcus's boarding pass, making calls to verify procedures, Marcus stood still, hands clasped in front of him, eyes fixed on the TV screen mounted on the wall, broadcasting the morning news, stock market updates, tech mergers, and a brief segment about a discrimination scandal recently exposed at a major financial conglomerate flickered across the screen. For a fleeting moment, a thought crossed Marcus's mind. How many people of color had endured in silence as he had over the years? How many had stayed quiet to keep their seats, to avoid being labeled troublemakers, to survive in spaces not built for them? Today, he didn't have to stay silent anymore. When the officer returned with a reluctant nod, "You're free to return to the lounge, everything's cleared," Marcus replied softly. "Thank you. And thanks for the thorough verification." But deep within, the system had already logged every second of his detention, every device accessed, every random check he'd been subjected to, every moment of injustice, every prejudiced glance, every word cloaked in professional veneer. It was all being recorded. No one knew. Not until the storm broke. Elijah Turner wasn't sure if he was making the dumbest decision of his life. He'd just sent his 3rd text to Chris, his best friend in the tech department, his words dripping with panic. "Bro, they just humiliated Marcus Reid in front of the entire lounge. I saw it with my own eyes." You know, the Marcus Reid. Reid Technologies, they kicked him out like he was a fraud. We're so screwed. Elijah pressed himself against a pillar, scanning the area with the wide-eyed look of someone who'd witnessed something they weren't meant to see. His internal badge still hung crookedly on his wrinkled shirt. He'd never imagined that day 11 of his internship would be the day his fate took a sharp turn. At the other end of the airport, Chris Nolan nearly spilled his coffee as he read the message. Every vein in his body seemed to tighten. Marcus Reid. To Chris, that name wasn't just a symbol, it was a hero. His senior thesis had been built on the machine learning algorithms Reid had pioneered 15 years ago. That man had changed how the world processed data. And now, Regalus Airways had just booted him from the lounge? No, he couldn't sit still. Chris immediately logged into the internal network. His first command, pull all camera footage from the lounge area over the past 30 minutes. His second, send the logs to someone he'd Never contacted before, it was the only address that popped up on an encrypted signal from a shadow server he'd just noticed running in the background. In the basement of an office building 5 blocks from the airport, Carmen Hale sat before a control panel displaying hundreds of data access points nationwide. But one frame made her pause. The video. A polished black man being denied service, questioned, escorted away, while every other passenger was offered drinks and laughter in the lounge. The footage didn't need narration. The images alone were suffocating. "Time to cast the net," Carmen said into her earpiece. Her voice was low, steady, like a command issued from the heart of an underground military operation. "Activate Black Code. Identify potential assets, internal staff with records of ethical conduct, whistleblowers who filed complaints, or those ignored by management. The network won't be built from power, but from pain." Rachel Monroe, a young check-in desk employee, was the first name on the list. A simple message arrived in her personal inbox through an anonymous system. "You saw what happened today, and you know it wasn't right equals right. If you're ready to speak up, you won't be alone." Rachel stared at the text for 10 minutes. She remembered Marcus Reid's eyes, not angry, not scornful, just sad. A quiet sadness, like an iceberg drifting beneath the surface. She knew Denise Crawford was wrong. She knew what she had to do. She hit reply. Meanwhile, in the third-floor security office, Douglas Carter, the man who'd escorted Marcus out of the lounge, was re-watching the video for the 3rd time. Each viewing made him feel less like a neutral party and more like an accomplice. He hadn't spoken up when Denise insulted Marcus, hadn't reacted when a nearby passenger sneered. He'd just followed procedure. But was procedure the same as justice? His phone buzzed, an unknown number, tagged with a ReadNet identifier. He hesitated, then answered. "This is Carter." One question. A woman's voice cut through. Cold, sharp, slicing through excuses. "Today, did you serve Regalus or what's right?" Douglas didn't answer immediately, but when he hung up, he knew. He'd just picked a side. At the same time, in an internal tech staff chat, a flurry of messages began. "Anyone else notice the camera log suddenly shifting? Some records are being copied to an external server." Reid striking back, and this time, he's got allies. The war didn't start with bombs. It began with an intern sending a text, a young employee daring to reply to an email, a security guard rewatching a video and refusing to look away. Marcus Reid didn't need to shout for justice. He just needed to plant a signal, and those who'd been overlooked would find it like a flame in the fog. 8:42 a.m. Eastern Time. On Regalus Airways' internal dispatch system, a small yellow alert blinked. Unusual data activity detected. Log export from internal comms server. No one paid it much mind. 3 minutes later, the alert turned red. Carmen Hale monitored it all from Reid Technologies' underground command center, where the walls weren't lined with awards, but with screens teeming with live data streams. "Begin downloading the Delta email batch. All internal exchanges tied to discriminatory lounge policies." Her voice was firm, no emphasis needed. The team had been waiting for this moment since the first day of the Raven campaign. On the screens, over 3,000 emails with hauntingly repetitive keywords. Closely monitor passengers who don't fit the VIP profile. Increase frequency of checks on potential risk customers. Verbal directive from senior leadership, no paper trail. Carmen exhaled slowly. Send it to the press pool. Prioritize New York Times, Washington Post, and independent reporter Emily Rhodes. 10:04 a.m. Twitter/X erupted. Emily Rhodes, a Pulitzer-winning investigative journalist, posted the first bombshell. Exclusive. Regalus Airways instructed staff to monitor black passengers in first-class cabins. Over 3,000 leaked internal emails reveal a deliberately maintained system of discrimination. Regalus exposed. Fly while black. 30 minutes later, a second post dropped. The man ejected from the lounge, Marcus Reid, CEO of Reid Technologies. The world began to wake up. 11:37 a.m. Regalus HQ, main lobby, Atlanta. Charles Langston, the CEO, was finishing his morning whiskey when his assistant burst in, pale-faced. "You need to see this." The screen lit up with notifications. CNN, breaking. Marcus Reid denied service over racial profiling. MSNBC, Regalus, an empire of classist discrimination in aviation. BuzzFeed, shocking details from leaked internal emails via anonymous source. Charles gripped his glass, his face flushing red. "How do we handle this?" Vincent Drake, nicknamed the media cleanup guy, had just landed from an overnight flight from Zurich and now stood before him. "We hit back," Vincent said, his voice icy calm. "Dig up anything to smear Reid. A rumor, an old fling, a vague financial filing, anything to turn the press against him." Meanwhile, across the city, Marcus's network had emerged from the shadows. Rachel Monroe, the young check-in clerk, had sent a 2-page affidavit to Emily Rhodes detailing how Denise Crawford routinely demanded extra verification for black passengers, especially those in suits or carrying luxury luggage. Douglas Carter, the veteran security guard, had signed on as a witness, providing copies of 12 video logs where he'd been ordered to escort brand-unfit passengers out of the lounge. Elijah Turner, the lowly intern who'd sparked it all, was now writing a blog post. "I watched an empire tremble because one man didn't turn away." 12:22 p.m. The media exploded. Regalus held an emergency press conference. The PR director's face was stiff. "We're committed to a thorough investigation. This may be the misguided actions of a few individuals, not reflective of our core company values." That statement became a nationwide meme. At a small Chicago cafe, Joanna Ellis, former tech industry CEO and Marcus's mentor, stared at her screen with a steely gaze. "They're starting to blame individuals," she said. "That's when the system cracks." That evening, Marcus Reid stepped into his secure data center. On the wall was a structural map of Regalus Airways. Every branch, every every senior executive, Carmen reported. "We've successfully traced offshore fund transfers linked to Whitestone Capital, Regalus's parent company, the same one that denied your first loan in 2002. Marcus said nothing. He just stared at the network unfolding on the control panel. A web of lies, a counterstrike web ready to strike, and he was the spider at its center. The fight was no longer about a lounge. It was about an empire, and now that empire was starting to sway. 41st floor boardroom. Coal Dynamics headquarters, San Francisco. The room was minimalist but exuded authority. A glass wall faced the bay where the late afternoon sun spilled across the water like molten gold. On the table sat 2 glasses of water, one for the host, one for the guest. Richard Langston, CEO of Regalus Airways, arrived on time but had been kept waiting for over 40 minutes. No apologies. No one offered coffee. When the door finally swung open, Marcus Reid entered in absolute silence. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up slightly, as if he didn't need armor to step onto this battlefield. He didn't. "Mr. Reid," Richard stood, attempting to maintain a veneer of civility, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of offense. Marcus didn't shake his hand. He sat across from him, placing a slim tablet on the table. "No need to beat around the bush," Marcus began. "I know you're not here out of goodwill. You're here because you're bleeding out." "Bleeding," Richard smirked. "Don't think a few articles and videos can topple an empire." "You're wrong," Marcus said, his gaze unwavering. "They don't topple it. They just make people see how rotten it's been all along." Richard let out a forced chuckle. "So, now it's your turn to name a price. How much to make you back off?" Marcus tilted his head, a nameless sadness flickering in his eyes. "The thing is, I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to inform." He activated the tablet. The screen lit up with a graph. Regalus's stock, plummeting in a near-vertical drop, synced perfectly with the timeline of investigations, whistleblower testimonies, and legal warnings. Right now, Regalus's market value is a third of what it was 3 weeks ago. Investors are jumping ship, And from what I've heard from the Securities and Exchange Commission, those leaked emails won't just lead to fines. Richard's hands tightened on the table. I'm still the CEO. I still control the company. Marcus nodded slightly. Until the end of today. He rotated the tablet. Now it displayed a proposal to acquire 51% of Regalus Airways shares at $20 per share, 80% above the current market trading price. A generous offer, Marcus said, for a company in free fall. Richard stared at the figure, then let out a dry, unconfident laugh. You think I'll hand it over just because of some numbers and headlines? Marcus didn't respond immediately. He tapped a command on the tablet. The image shifted. A personal email from Richard with the subject line, "Bury the incident, increase payouts, threaten HR whistleblowers if needed." Richard's face drained of color. Marcus spoke slowly, almost a whisper. I don't need your agreement. I just need you to choose how you exit this story. Richard shot to his feet. This is blackmail. No, Marcus replied. This is cleanup. A deadly silence fell. Then Marcus spoke, his voice soft like an indictment. I'm not buying Regalus because I want an airline. I'm buying it because I won't let a system like this keep standing. I'm not seeking revenge. I'm taking out the trash. And you are the last bag I need to carry out of the building. Richard didn't respond. He just stood there, like a statue stripped of breath. Finally, Marcus picked up the tablet and turned off the screen. There's a car waiting downstairs. If you want to leave, the back exit will dodge the press. As Richard walked out, his steps felt longer, heavier. No one escorted him out of a lounge like Marcus had been, but no one stopped him either. Marcus Reid remained seated, alone, watching the sunset dissolve into the water. On the table, only one glass of water remained, still full, untouched. 3 months after Regalus Airways officially became the property of Coal Dynamic, the skies over Washington, D.C. seemed to take on a different hue, not because of the weather, but because today a new airline took flight, and with it, a promise. Reagan International Airport glowed as if it knew it needed to shine brighter than usual. At runway 4, a small stage stood beside the first plane, emblazoned with the words, Coal Air where everyone belongs. No slogan was chosen by chance. Marcus Reid stood by the aircraft's wing, dressed in a simple navy suit, no extravagance, no diamonds, no overwhelming display of power, just a man once ejected from a lounge, now standing before a plane bearing his name. Below, hundreds clapped. Among them were those who'd spoken up. Rachel Monroe from the check-in desk, Douglas Carter, the veteran guard, now Coal Air's security director, and Elijah Turner, the former intern, now officially part of the company's young leadership program. Everyone knew none of them were heroes. They were just people who hadn't looked away. Marcus stepped onto the podium, and the applause faded. He didn't need a booming mic, no theatrics, just a low, steady voice, like the heartbeat of a system reborn. 3 months ago, we watched a system collapse, not because of finances, but because of a lack of ethics. Today, we're not just launching a new airline. We're declaring that kindness isn't an expensive option. It's the strongest foundation any industry can have. He glanced at the front row, where Helen Voss, Coal Air's new CEO, beamed, but with a radiant smile. She'd been the first woman passed over for promotion at Regalus for lacking assertiveness. Now she led a billion-dollar airline. We've proven that from ashes something better can rise, if we're brave enough to face the truth, and kind enough to start over without bitterness. After the speech, guests were invited aboard to tour Coal Air's new interior. There were no old-school first-class or economy seats. Instead, a diverse experience cabin, designed horizontally, without stark class barriers. Seats were customized for the elderly, people with disabilities, and unaccompanied children. Each bore an etched inscription, "You belong here, just as you are." In the operations cabin, up front, Rachel and Erica, a former employee once threatened for speaking out, reviewed the flight roster together. They smiled, not widely, just a faint smile, as if they'd walked through the unbelievable and still stood here, witnesses to something good. In the empty cabin, Marcus sat alone in a middle row. He rested his hand on the small window, sunlight streaming onto his dark skin like a wordless proclamation. No one would chase him from this seat again, and this time he'd brought a generation with him. Coal Air wasn't just an airline. It was a quiet message to those who'd been made to feel they didn't belong. The door was always open. It was just locked from the inside before. Now, the key is in your hands. Southside Chicago, Linden Elementary School. A late spring afternoon. The sun wasn't blazing, but it was warm. The breeze didn't howl, but it was enough to make the small flags on the fence flutter like a gentle greeting. Marcus Reid stood before the weathered, peeling gate. This place, once his only escape from a narrow childhood world, and today, it became the entryway to a new journey. "You sure you don't want to hold this downtown at a hotel?" Dr. Angela White, the current principal, asked as they crossed the old stone-paved courtyard. Marcus just shook his head. "The first time I saw a microchip was in a science class here. The first time I was called out of place was here too. The place that planted both dreams and wounds should also be where the healing begins. In the old gym, decorated with blue, white, and silver balloons, nearly 400 students waited. A few whispered that he's a billionaire, but their eyes didn't linger on wealth. They fixed on presence. Marcus didn't arrive with fanfare. He came with an old metal box placed before the podium. Inside it, a battered notebook from 30 years ago, its cover frayed, its pages filled with scrawled equations and tangled circuit diagrams. "I used to sit in the third row left corner," he began, resting a hand on the worn book. "I wrote these numbers not to be smart, but to survive." The room fell silent. Marcus scanned the crowd, his gaze catching a boy clutching a tattered science fiction book. The boy ducked his head when Marcus looked at him, as if accustomed to being seen as different. Marcus stepped off the stage and walked over to him. "What's your name?" "Jaden, sir." "Jaden, do you know the first thing the world does when you're better than it?" "No, sir." "They'll try to make you believe you don't belong there. But don't forget, the people who truly change the world always start by feeling out of place in it." Marcus placed the old notebook in Jaden's hands. "Keep this, and if there's ever a day you feel like giving up, open the first page. You'll see a kid like you and know you're not alone." The event closed with the announcement of the Coal Future Lab, a state-of-the-art tech center to be built right on the school grounds, open to all students and the community. No tuition required, no grades needed, just curiosity and a heart that hadn't lost hope. That evening, as Marcus left the school, streetlights cast streaks of memory onto the pavement. He didn't cry, but his eyes were still, like a lake rippling faintly. A reporter waiting outside asked, "What do you think about returning to a place that once called you too different to fit in?" Marcus looked up at the sky, where a Coal Air plane sliced through the clouds. Then he smiled. "I didn't come back for recognition. I came back to do what this place never did for me, to believe in a kid, before the world starts doubting them. And sometimes, a new system doesn't begin with rules, but with a different gaze toward what was once overlooked."